So it's a very complicated geopolitical mosaic.
The economic moves that Trump is making, the reciprocal tariffs, is it about taking down China? Hi everyone, welcome to GBN Originals. My guest today is investigative journalist and podcaster Maajid Nawaz, who's a good friend of mine. We've found many points of common ground over the years when it comes to wanting a peaceful, tolerant world. Welcome, Maajid Nawaz.
Hi, Neil. Thank you. And I apologize in advance if I'm squinting or sniffling. I'm suffering a terrible bout of hay fever, but hopefully we'll get through this.
No, that's a common complaint at the moment, so we will work with that. Don't worry. Now, Madge, we're all watching Donald Trump's various moves as he seeks, in his own words, to make America great again. He's got it all going on, just months into his second term. I wonder if we can start, though, by talking about Iran. President Trump has made some bellicose noises about Iran. Numerous commentators have warned that war with Iran would be next door to World War III, if not on the same site as World War III. This week, however, sitting alongside Benjamin Netanyahu, President Trump said that there would be high-level talks this weekend to consider the nuclear issue, amongst other things. He said that he didn't want to be involved in a war with Iran, and he said that Israel didn't want to be in a war with Iran. And I wonder, first of all, do you think that choice of words was deliberate, sitting beside Benjamin Netanyahu, who has fantasized about war with Iran for a lifetime? I wonder if Donald Trump was positioning himself as better representing the people of Israel when he said that Israel did not want war with Iran.
Well, it's a good starting point, Neil, and I agree with you. I think that Donald Trump wasn't speaking there on behalf of Netanyahu, but rather was speaking to Netanyahu as well as to the rest of us, telling him, in effect, that he needs to be a bit careful with how he proceeds. If you look at Netanyahu's face during that conversation, it betrays his sentiment, a bit like it did when Trump surprised Netanyahu with the entire Gaza Riviera scheme, which everybody was scratching their heads at. And it turns out, of course, it's kickstarted a whole bunch of negotiations with Arabs about how they can be involved in redeveloping Gaza, which was, again, Trump saying, we discussed that last time on your show. So I do think that the Israeli population very much wants to see an end to Netanyahu's premiership, and they have been trying for a long time. Of course, the nature of the proportionate system in Israel means Netanyahu is allowed to prop up a minority government through a coalition, and that's what makes it quite difficult to remove him. But the Israelis have been very dissatisfied with Netanyahu and probably are war weary, though, of course, the Iran file hasn't quite yet come to a close, though it is very important that Trump does start negotiations directly with Iran. And the reason that is, if I can preempt perhaps where this conversation is going, the reason why it's so important for the Americans to have bilateral conversations directly with Iran is because the conflict with Iran isn't just a conflict between Israel and Iran. It's a regional conflict between Israel, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and its Gulf allies, over not just whether or not there should be a Palestinian state, because of course the Saudis and the Iranians agree on that element of it. Netanyahu is the obstacle there. But where the Saudis and the Iranians disagree is over things like Yemen. Now, Yemen, keep in mind, is next door to Saudi Arabia in the Arabian Peninsula. And so it's pretty crucial, a bit like Mexico is to the US, Northern Ireland is to the UK. Yemen is pretty crucial to Saudi Arabia's national security. It sits within the same peninsula as the greater, bigger country, Saudi Arabia. And of course, Iran, via the Houthi militia, has a presence in Yemen. That country's been through a terrible civil war, Saudi and Iran on either end of that proxy war in Yemen. So despite them agreeing on Palestine, Iran and Saudi Arabia disagree on Yemen, and they disagree quite viciously, not just on Yemen. Prior to that, on Syria, of course, Assad was allied with Iran and the Saudis were backing the insurgents. That situation has come to a head now, and the Iranian allied, Putin allied regime of Assad has had to flee, and he is now in Moscow. So you can see there are areas of contention between Saudi Arabia and Iran that in some instances are equal to the areas of contention that exist between Iran and Israel. So it's a very complicated geopolitical mosaic. And that's why the bilateral talks between America and Iran are important, because if it were just an Israel-Iran dynamic, it wouldn't actually address the real problem, which is there's a wider regional struggle going on here. Of course, sectarianism, Sunni versus Shia Islamic factions, is an element, but that's insofar as because they are being exacerbated on purpose by geopolitical powers. The real problem is geostrategic. Of course, as with is always the case, people that play divide and conquer games will, they will put salt into the wounds to exacerbate existing sectarian differences, but only to achieve their political aims. So the sectarian issue is relevant, but actually what's more relevant is things like Red Sea ports, which of course the Houthis have been very, very jealous over guarding and preventing access to British and other shipping due to the Israel conflict. But Red Sea ports and other such strategic access to both ports and water supply, which is a crucial issue in the Middle East. And then on top of that, of course, land such as Gaza and on a broader level, Palestine. All of these become issues that become crucial to resolve. And I'll say lastly that the bilateral conversations have some precedent, Neil. If you remember, the US via Qatar had bilateral conversations with the Taliban in Afghanistan, leading to a similar exclusionary process for the Karzai's old Afghanistan regime that wasn't involved in those bilateral talks. And it, in the end, led to the collapse of Karzai's regime and to the coming to power of the Taliban. And I think these talks are headed in a direction where normalization with Iran is definitely on the table.
In the context of the upcoming talks, how important do you think it is that it would appear that where the US has been targeting Houthis in Yemen, that they have not been able to knock out the Houthis' ability to launch? Now, that's Yemen, and Iran is a much bigger, better equipped entity than Yemen. Is it relevant that Trump's operating in an environment where it's been seen that US has not been able to knock out Houthi potential? When the looming threat of or promise or whatever of war with Iran is out there, doesn't exactly make the US look as if it's in the all-dominant position that it might want to be seen in.
Yes, and Trump's obviously very bellicose and has a slogan, peace through strength, which is actually the best way to make peace is when you're in a position of strength. But let's keep in mind the direction of travel. There are already signs, the writing is already on the wall, that we are moving towards a grand regional settlement for peace, which I write about a lot in my Radical Dispatch via my Substack. And that is that if we look at what's happened prior to this, you can see the direction of travel is headed towards the de-escalation of World War III. And we were at the precipice. It's not just the negotiations between Trump and Putin over Ukraine, which are part of that de-escalation but haven't happened yet. But the ones that have happened, we can already point to. We mentioned Afghanistan. The withdrawal of US troops from Afghanistan was negotiated under Trump in his first term. The chaotic way in which it was done, if you remember, happened in the first few months of the Biden administration. And Biden is responsible for making sure that those last-minute preparations didn't end up as terribly as we obviously saw on our cameras, people falling from aeroplanes. But the actual hard graft of the negotiations were done under Trump's first term. So there's an example where Trump's direction of travel has been anti-war and withdrawing troops. And to achieve that, they facilitated dialogue directly with the Taliban in Qatar. But that's not just happened in Afghanistan. We saw that was reciprocated by Russia in Syria. Again, direction of travel being to de-escalate World War III. The Russians were backing Assad and they are backing Iran. The Russian Navy withdrew from Syria prior to Jolani, now the Prime Minister Ahmed al-Shara, prior to him marching into Damascus. The Russians had already withdrawn their army without a fight. Upon seeing that, the Iranians took the signal and withdrew support from Assad as well. And that's all documented. It's not in dispute. The Russians pulling their army back is a matter of fact. So you can see there a reciprocation for what the Americans did in Afghanistan. Keep in mind, the Russians were in Afghanistan before the Americans were. In the 1980s. So that's next door to key strategic Russian interests in Central Asia, former USSR states, now the Commonwealth of Independent States. So you've got a quid pro quo where I think you can see both sides removing their forces and de-escalating conflict, now talking directly with each other over Ukraine. And it's for that reason that I think that these talks with the bilateral talks with the US and Iran are also going to end in that in a similar pattern. The Russians will not back Iran for a broader World War III style conflict. If there was a war with Iran, of course, it would embroil China and Russia. We'd be back to the precipice of World War III because it's as Syria was for Putin, Iran even more so is a red line for the Russians and the Chinese. They will not allow the physical military occupation of Iran. We saw that they drew that line already in Syria. It happened with Iraq. They drew the line in Syria. That's why we know already, Iran being a much more powerful nation than Syria, they won't allow it to happen to Iran. And that's why for them, it will be a matter of all-out conflict. We know Trump doesn't want that. And that's why there is, as I always say to you, Neil, a lot of cause for optimism here, despite what Netanyahu wants. Netanyahu doesn't want this.
Is it significant that subsequent to Donald Trump sat alongside Benjamin Netanyahu in the White House, that the Iranian foreign minister replied, as it were, and said and made plain that the talks should be indirect, that it wouldn't be the US and Iran sitting together face to face, but that it would happen through, or he implied that it would be happening through some sort of intermediary, maybe Saudi Arabia. Does that matter, or is that just about face saving?
Yeah, you always have what's called track 2 diplomacy, which is always usually direct but unacknowledged. And the Taliban conversations in Qatar were like that for a long time. Anything in public that, or track 1, that involves Saudi Arabia can only be a good thing because, of course, remember, Saudi Arabia is a party to the conflict with Iran. And so what we are, I think, going to see is the red line for the Americans is that Iran absolutely cannot acquire nuclear weapons. That's something they share with Netanyahu. That's a red line for Israel. Now, of course, Israel has a neither confirm nor deny policy on its own nuclear capabilities, but that's fine because next door to Iran is Pakistan. Pakistan has nuclear capabilities. It's a huge Muslim majority nation with a strong standing army. So Israel, with some merit, argues that, look, we're the only world's Jewish state. We need to be able to protect ourselves. So let's park the question of Israel's nuclear capabilities because, of course, the world knows they have them and they deny they have them. Let's park that for a minute. The Saudis, the Israelis, and the Americans agree that Iran shouldn't acquire them. And if you ignore Israel for a second, the main reason is that it would even escalate. It would cause an arms race between the Saudis and the Iranians. So there's a separate problem it causes, which you just cannot have happening in the Middle East in this current war-torn climate. And so it just makes sense to say Iran cannot have nuclear weapons. Then the Saudis are going to want them. You're going to get into a whole bunch of difficult situations. So if that red line is accepted, which it should be, and it's quite logical, we end up in a scenario where the Iranians are promised economic prosperity. They're allowed to develop economically. Of course, the sanctions on the Iranian regime have been affecting the Iranian population for a long time. And you open up Iran to trade with the region. Of course, the Saudis are already headed in that direction as well. Add into that the redevelopment of Gaza involving regional powers, the Riviera concept that Trump surprised Netanyahu with or ambushed him with. But you add the regional Arab nations, Egypt, Saudis and others, helping the Americans to redevelop Gaza. And you end up with a scenario where, as after World War II, if you look within 2 generations, don't forget that it's only our grandparents' generation that came off the back of that terrible conflict. Within 2 generations, nobody can even conceive of an all-out direct hot war with Germany anymore, whether you're Britain or America. It's seen as it's a friendly nation. So you can very quickly, within a generation or 2, at least 2 maybe, get back to a scenario where nations are very friendly again. And I think the Middle East is headed in that direction, and it will be opening up trade with Iran, opening up diplomatic and all manner of relationships in exchange for the Iranians ditching their nuclear aspirations, but a Palestinian state will be crucial in that grand regional settlement for peace, and it will come under the banner of the Abraham Accords, revived.
In X years, however, whatever time period, let's leave that to one side, but in X years' time, what do you see as being the Palestinian circumstances in Gaza? How will they be living? Who will be living there, and under what terms?
So Gaza is a very interesting and difficult scenario because I speak as a Pakistani heritage British Muslim, and Pakistan was initially two separate countries, East and West Pakistan, after partition with India, curiously, around the same, literally within the year of Israel's creation, 1947, 1948, respectively. But when in 47, Pakistan was created and carved out of India, post-British Raj, East Pakistan and is now Bangladesh in the 1971 war that India supported against Pakistan. And it split into two nations. So you've got a scenario where the Palestinian state could start off as two nations. And that's, as I say, with the history of Pakistan in mind, something that's very difficult. Gaza is obviously geographically closer to Egypt, and the Rafah crossing being the crossing from Gaza into Egypt. So the Gaza question is the real concern here as to what happens with it and how that becomes part of a West Bank Palestinian state. It is possible. It's not impossible to do. It would require some serious redevelopment first anyway in the Gaza Strip with Arab involvement. And then we can see what happens. But a Palestinian state, the Israeli sticking point, of course, security. The main sticking point with the Israelis is that a state, an independent state, means an independent state. It cannot be what the Israelis have been doing to date, which is saying we can grant you autonomy, but our army controls the borders. That's not an independent state. That isn't self-determination. And so the Israelis, through very, very difficult negotiations, are going to have to accept borders with a Palestinian state. But for that to happen, there needs to be negotiating partners who are also, in turn, not hell-bent on doing everything they can to destroy Israel. And this is where Iran comes in. Because if you fix the Iranian problem, you fix the funding to groups like, for example, Hamas and Hezbollah. So if we can address the Iranian question, we deal with the funding that flows from Iran to Hamas and Hezbollah. The last obstacle then be to have somebody on the Israeli side that can also talk to peace. And that's a matter of time. Netanyahu is not going to last forever. And whoever comes next may well be the candidate for initiating those conversations.
Maajid, I listen very carefully to everything that you have to say on this matter. I also listen to other voices. Jeffrey Sachs, who's a very credible, articulate voice. Also, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, sometime White House advisor. Now, very recently, Douglas Macgregor has been continuing to say that he doesn't make any bones about it that Netanyahu governs US foreign policy in relation to the Middle East. Is that something that chimes with your understanding of Netanyahu and his relationship with the US? Is he the tail that wags the dog?
I have a great respect for Colonel Macgregor and his views, for example, on the Ukraine war, very, very good. This question of whether it's the tail wagging the dog, Israel, US, US, Israel, is an age-old one in the Middle East debate. And my view on this is I think Trump is the exception to that rule. I think Trump's rise, them being globalists, and Netanyahu, by the way, is a very senior figure in the globalist cabal. The globalists' attempts to prevent Trump's rise, and Trump's rise despite the globalists' attempts to prevent him, is all an indication that in Trump's case, the tail is unable to wag the dog. Because in Trump's case, America has found a voice through MAGA, the base, which doesn't need many of the dependencies that those globalists were able to leverage against previous politicians. If you've got the public on your side, then even economic woes, even stock market crashes, as we're witnessing right now, if you've got the base on side and the base is willing to hold the line for you, and you can see this with Trump. During this recent example, which I imagine we're going to get to, but when the stock markets bet against Trump, as I put in my Radical Dispatch from last Tuesday, but this bit's only in the members only section. But it states that the opinion polls, the popularity of Trump, amazingly, and this is, I put the polls in there, anyone can go and check the receipts. Amazingly, the least likely people you'd think that would support Trump, his support among those people has risen after this debacle with the stock markets and the tariffs, the reciprocal tariffs. So who are they? Ethnic minority support for Trump is skyrocketing. It was already, and that's what won him largely, the vote in those swing states such as Michigan, where Trump thanked the Muslim voters. He then thanked the Hispanic voters. He thanked the black voters. That vote base now, it's skyrocketing in support for Trump, and the polls are demonstrating that. Likewise, who else? 18 to 24-year-old voters, skyrocketing during this stock market situation. And thirdly, Democrats and independent voters. All those three categories, support for Trump went up after the stock market has attempted to turn on him. So when you have the MAGA base and you have that very strong populist support base, you don't need, you do need the economy, of course, but the economic hardship that globalists are able to bring through, turning certain screws and pushing certain buttons, it no longer has that effect. You're no longer, living in fear of losing that voter base. So I think in Trump's case, the tail isn't wagging the dog.
You mentioned globalism. The globalists, clearly, it would appear, I've heard you say that this is everything that's happening in relation to these reciprocal tariffs is about Trump attempting to take down globalism. Is that the case? And is it ultimately the economic moves that Trump is making, the reciprocal tariffs, is it about taking down China? Not militarily, but in every other way.
Well, yes, it is taking down China economically, but we got to understand, first of all, why. What's going on here? Well, for a long, long time, the post-World War II arrangement was that America would have a trading relationship with all those countries that it effectively dominated militarily by guaranteeing their security, in some cases with physical troops on the ground. Look at the NATO across Europe. Germany is effectively occupied by American troops, but because it's friendly and by invite, it's not an occupation. But NATO is what secures Europe's borders. And that's all been there through the Marshall Plan since World War II, because the victory against Nazi Germany was total. Total meaning it ended in a physical military occupation by American troops in Europe, and they never left. They haven't left till today, which is the whole debate around NATO. What that comes with, when you're an empire in that way, it comes with certain consequences. The British Empire faced similar consequences. To be able to maintain your, for want of a better phrase, rule in those countries that you occupy, you agree to allow them to economically prosper so that their populations don't revolt against you. It's a bread for occupation deal that you make. It's the same as they did in Afghanistan and Iraq. You basically fund the existence of the infrastructure in that government, in that state, in that nation, so that your troops can stay there without too much trouble. That arrangement led to non-reciprocal tariffs for the US with all countries around the world, because the world's currency was the petrodollar. So America required physical presence near oil rigs and strategic ports. In return, it promised those nations trade. So those nations were able to sell their goods to an American market. The American goods weren't able to go into those nations' markets because it would have flooded them. But instead, the trade-off was, okay, but our troops are there. We guarantee the security. We get access to the resources. That arrangement is no longer sustainable. What Trump is now trying to do is, as we've just discussed, pull back from war, pull his troops out of Afghanistan. The reciprocation was Russia pulls out of Iran. When you start pulling back, you end up in a scenario where you're no longer the world's empire. Well, if that's the case, then you no longer have to compensate for that with uneven trade deals. If your troops aren't there anymore, you don't have to promise people a prosperity in return for not rebelling against you. That requires leveling the playing field in terms of trade too. So it's all connected. The US military withdrawal is connected to the desire to level the playing field. How does China get involved? Well, China was the nation, because it's a one-party state run by the Chinese Communist Party that has embraced technocracy. China was the state that the globalists were using to siphon and move all their money towards. So if you think of global finance, big money, think of the banking sector, then one of the consequences of globalism was when they moved manufacturing to China. Why was that done? For the purpose of seeking never-ending profit. Cheap labor and cheap supplies, cheap production in China meant Nike, fast fashion, and tech, because of the rare earth elements that China has, all moved to China. That hollowed out our economies. It's stuff we're living through now. Prices went up. Nothing was affordable. People were finding it difficult to get work. In the UK's case, coastal towns were hollowed out. In the US's case, what they call the flyover areas were all hollowed out. People ended up drug addicted, depression, mental health problems, physical health problems. Our countries became hollowed out. And that is what the tariffs are seeking to reverse by agreeing a level playing field when it comes to trade with the US. In return for US troops pulling back from the world, right? You end up in a scenario where, yes, the tech sector suffers because they were outsourcing everything to China. But as a result, when you end up with the correction and prices go up as a result, you realize it's cheaper to start manufacturing at home. When you start doing that, jobs come back home. And at the end of this, as long as people understand what's going on, that this is a reverse gear for globalism, that everything you and I from our generation, let's say I'm Gen X, right? We've witnessed this in our lifetimes. I remember when I was young in Essex, the idea of a foreign restaurant was an Italian. That was the idea of a foreign exotic meal. You'd go to your local Italian pizzeria and eat spaghetti bolognese. That was a foreign meal, right? So we remember a time when everything was made at home. These days, go try buy Doc Martens from a shop. They're all made in China. Neil, I've literally got the only version of Doc Martens you can get made in Britain. They were twice the price because there's only one factory left that makes them. The original factory, which is now preserved as a blooming museum, right? And they still make these in that one factory, the Doc Martens. And on the shelf, I went to Carnaby Street to buy them. There's a Doc Martens store there, and they had all the Doc Martens made in China, and then they had a separate section with a big British Union flag on it, made in Britain, and it was twice the price, right? Everyone, our generation, has seen this happen, and it's not just Doc Martens. It's, Rolls Royce, it's everything, right? All of the Bentleys, whatever we used to associate with Britain. So we're going to end up in a scenario where some of that, not all of it, but some of it will start returning home. With that comes jobs. With that, of course, comes economic prosperity. Of course, prices go up, but it ends up stabilizing because, people end up being able to earn because they're working so they can afford the prices.
On that basis, is there a parting of the ways, ideologically or whatever, between Trump and Elon Musk, given Elon Musk's dependency on tech and cheap labor outside of the US?
Most certainly. So, in fact, the most affected billionaires by this have been Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, Bezos. In my Radical Dispatch from last Tuesday, I published a list of them. Number one was Elon Musk. He suffered the most because the electric vehicle industry that requires the lithium and other rare earth elements that they mine from the ground, in particular with electric car batteries using child slave labor, all of that will suffer. So Musk had his billions wiped off his value, as did the electric car industry generally. Zuckerberg had billions wiped off. Bezos the same. Because let's keep in mind that when I talk about globalism, we talk about technocracy. Globalism's aspiration is a one world military technocracy. Now, that's the fusion of corporate power with tech power with military might. The old military-industrial complex, but add tech to it. So those tech companies will suffer. Elon Musk publicly tried to be gentle about it, but he publicly criticized Trump over these tariffs, whereas others went all out in their attempts to criticize Trump, such as Bill Ackman, another billionaire, who then ended up having to retreat somewhat when he realized MAGA was not retreating whatsoever on this, and MAGA held the line. In fact, as we said, Trump support went up among the base. So what we're going to see with the tech sector, Ukraine comes into this too. Because the war in Ukraine, of course, let's keep in mind, hopefully we get a peace deal there, but the rare earth elements that are being mined in China for the microchips and so on and so forth, they also exist in abundance in Ukraine. And so that also gives you a bit of an understanding as to why certain factions wanted to fight so ridiculously long and, unnecessarily in Ukraine. Because, of course, some of them are looking at that as an alternative source for those rare earth elements.
Maajid, I always know that when I speak to you that I'm going to, whether I like it or not, I'm going to get a kind of a vicarious injection of optimism about the global picture. Your energy in that regard is irresistible, actually. But I know that you have somewhere else to be this morning. In that light, thank you so much for being generous with your time, and I'll continue this conversation with you at another time. Thank you, Maajid Nawaz.
Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you.